September. And firstly, let me apologise for my recent absences from these airwaves. I've had a number of problems, both with my own health and with family issues, so these things have to come first. But here I am, back again with a pretty sore left shoulder, which I dislocated about a week ago, and back to work. But, you know, we have to earn a crust. Anyway, I have a couple of items in the news today, which I think warrant discussion at the very least. And they're mostly concerning the UK's recent, or UK government's claims recently to a major success in attracting a foreign national military ship contract. And if I remember correctly, I think this was from the Norwegian Navy. But anyway, I'm sure somebody will correct me if it's not the Norwegian Navy. However, there was an order placed for a group of frigates from memory, and it's been a while since I read the article, approximately a dozen frigates, something like 13 frigates ordered by this foreign state. Now, the British Labour government is claiming this as a major success and a reason why Scotland benefits from being in the Union with England. However, there's a bit more to this story than meets the eye, and it's worth remembering that there are already 13 frigates on order here in Scotland by the British military. The British Navy had 13 frigates on order, and that particular batch of frigates is still not finished. And that saga has been going on for about a decade. The frigates are being slowly constructed, but at nothing like the pace that you would imagine. But not only that, there is a deep-rooted problem within the British military. For decades now, particularly the Navy in the UK, has had suffered cuts, major cuts to its funding. And those cuts have involved things like reducing the number of military personnel and the number of sailors, effectively, in the United Kingdom's Navy. Now, considering the UK is an island and has now separated itself from the European Union and is, I think, probably on the boundaries of NATO now, there are a number of problems that it faces. There was a quote recently by a former British naval commander who had a lot to say about the state of the British Navy, and he wasn't pulling his punches when he described this. Now, one of the most, I think, interesting things about the British military at the moment, especially the Navy, is that it has a large number of vessels which are non-functional. At the present moment, I believe there is one of their ships which has not moved from port for over 1,000 days. Now, we're talking 3 years sitting in port, unable to move. Don't know what's wrong with it, but it's been unable to take to sea. The much vaunted and basically Labour-ordered construction of the 2 aircraft carriers that we now have has also seen problems because these aircraft carriers need a protection. So wherever they sail, they need to be shadowed by British attack submarines, which are on the hunt for enemy submarines, or anything, in fact, which might threaten a battle fleet, including one of these massive aircraft carriers, because they're a huge, tempting target. And yet, according to this ex-United Kingdom naval commander, there are no submarines shadowing the 2 aircraft carriers which the UK has already deployed. So that's one thing. So those aircraft carriers are now uniquely vulnerable due to cuts and the fact that there appears to be no available attack submarines to guard those military assets. I mean, they're huge. I mean, they're carrying F-35, F-22. Could be either, actually. I think it's F-35 vertical landing and short takeoff jets, basically built by the United States and costing a fortune. So there's a lot of money tied up in these, and they are relatively unprotected from particularly threats from below the surface. So there was that. But the most shocking thing that I heard was the fact that he claims that our nuclear deterrent, which is a fleet of, if I remember correctly, 5 nuclear-powered submarines containing Trident missiles, Only one of them is actually in service, and it's in port at the moment. So it's not at sea. It seems to be unable to sail at the moment, and therefore the so-called constantly at sea deterrent, the one that's supposed to be undetectable, is completely detectable because it's sitting in a base somewhere in the UK's waters, doing nothing. It's not doing its constant at sea deterrence at all. So we have a nuclear deterrent which is easily spotted by satellites, is not below the surface, and the rest of the fleet's boats, the other submarines, are non-serviceable. So what the hell's going on with the British Navy? I think the answer to that is British cuts. Cuts made by the UK government to a naval force which is supposed to be there to protect us from everything from a first nuclear strike by a belligerent foreign power, and I think in the past that has always been seen as being Russia, and an aircraft carrier or a couple of aircraft carriers, massive assets with enormously expensive aircraft on board, which do not have submarine protection that they need when they are deployed on a tour somewhere. So wherever they're going, whatever mission they have, they seem to be relatively vulnerable. All of these things don't point to a healthy military navy in any way. And so blowing the trumpet for the British shall we say, naval construction industry is all very well if you're manufacturing ships for a foreign power, like even a friendly power like Norway or wherever, or a NATO member, fellow NATO member. That's generally good because it's going to keep your shipyards busy, but your shipyards are already backlogged with orders for your own navy that haven't been completed for ships for which the British Ministry of Defence has not got the money to provide the personnel to actually operate those vessels, because that seems to be one of the fundamental problems the Navy faces at the moment. It's understaffed. There are not enough mariners, not enough sailors to actually people these military assets and to operate them effectively. So we have a navy which is rich in a backlog of hardware, but doesn't actually have the human beings necessary to operate the hardware. And the hardware that we do have that's still in the water is either tied up at port and unable to move, or has rendered their nuclear deterrent virtually unusable, because it's clearly visible to all and sundry, being on the surface in port, when it really should be under the North Atlantic somewhere, patrolling endlessly without surfacing. And that appears to be not happening according to this person's assessment. Now, this person is somebody in the know. I mean, any military commander or ex-retired commander will know the trajectory of the way the British Navy has been funded. And it seems to me that it's not being funded. But the Labour government appears to be doing very little about that. And I think that's of concern, because if you are going to operate a military defence strategy, it needs to be solid. Otherwise, it's meaningless. And somebody like Vladimir Putin, for example, knowing that the British nuclear deterrent is tied up somewhere in port and is not patrolling and is easily visible, becomes an instant target for a first strike because it's visible, right? And it always would be visible when one of these boats comes in to be replenished and another one goes out. There's always that period where they are vulnerable to aerial attack. The trouble is that they're vulnerable to aerial attack all the time right at the moment, according to this particular former commander. So I don't see that the British Navy is in a great state at the moment. And we know also that the British Army has been depleted consistently over decades. Its military equipment procurement has been vastly over expensive. Some of it has not arrived on time. In fact, a lot of it's not been delivered on time. Much of it, in fact, some of the vehicles that they ordered turned out to be very difficult for soldiers to operate. They were too noisy, they were too cramped, they were too hot, and so on. There were problems all across the board. Now, those problems may well have been solved now, and we do know that the British military manufacturing complex is now supplying considerable amounts of weaponry to Ukraine. which we are selling to them now. We're not giving this stuff away. Some of our surpluses went to Ukraine, things that we no longer needed or were going out of date. Some missiles that were reaching the end of their operational life were given to Ukraine because they were going to be scrapped anyway. But having the ability to manufacture weapons is one thing, but having a military with personnel to operate them is something completely different. And this is something which the Labour government, with its fixation on balancing its own books, has completely ignored, along with a lot of other dimensions to the economy, which it has completely ignored in this ridiculous drive to balance its own books at all costs, regardless of the effect that has on the population, on the working economy of the UK, that's the internal economy of money, financial markets and the banking sector, and all kinds of other things that have knock-on effects. So the UK is stumbling along, it seems, from one crisis to another, unable to fund the most basic things to protect its population from attack. For one thing, is one of the first duties of a government. And not only this Labour government, but the previous Tory governments and the previous Labour government before that seem to have no idea how to do that. And they don't look long term, and they don't think about how it's going to operate in the future and what the funding is going to be needed for that. And they also apply that same short term look to everything else, including social planning, the social security system, the tax system, and the way they calculate how well the British economy is actually faring is largely completely ignores the realities of daily life in the UK. It just doesn't actually take into account things. For example, like people who do voluntary work, or people who look after the children of others for free, like relatives. All these things are just expected to keep happening, and the UK government says, well, we don't need to do anything about it because these volunteers are doing it, which is all very well, but it's part of the economy because it allows other people to work who would otherwise have to look after their children. And so we have a government which ignores the fact that some of the older generation, many disabled people, and people who are unable to work for other reasons do a lot of vital work which promotes the economy by allowing other people to work. And that's largely ignored as well. So I guess what I'm saying to you here is that the UK government has no idea how to maintain a defensive posture, even one that it's developed over decades and can't seem to maintain anymore, which is bizarre considering all of the warlike rhetoric which is coming out of Westminster and Whitehall at the moment, preparing us to get involved in a war in Ukraine, which is highly unlikely. It's very easy to rattle the sabre and say we're going to march into Ukraine and then add once peace is declared. That's very different from being involved in a war. That's peacekeeping. That's completely different. But it's all being conflated together, and we're being told one story while something else is happening below the surface. And the thing that's happening below the surface is funding cuts, not just in the military, but across the board. And the Labour government will probably survive till the end of its term, and then we're going to have Farage's Reform Party taking over in England. It's not popular in Scotland, and I see another, what I would call a milkshake rebellion happening if Farage sticks his ugly head above the parapet over the border in Scotland. He's not a popular man here. So there's going to be problems in the future for Scotland, because we're going to be a target for a first strike, because submarines cannot get out of port. The nuclear deterrent cannot submerge and stay submerged long enough to provide any kind of protection, and Scotland becomes a target. It also has historically been used as both a dustbin for let's say dead military equipment. So things like shells and missiles and rockets, which are past their sell-by dates, have been dumped in nearshore Scottish waters by the British state over the years. We're also used largely as a way of putting dangerous nuclear weapons as far away from London as possible. That will continue, even though we're going to be more vulnerable to attack now because of underfunding. And all of these things are going to get worse and worse. And as reform takes over in England, the move or the lurch to the right, which we see happening across the board at the moment down there, is going to continue. And we're going to end up with a very right-wing English government and a very non-right-wing Scottish government of whatever complexion it is. And they're going to be knocking heads, and there's going to be friction, and there's going to be problems because of it, and they're going to get worse. So independence, I haven't mentioned it all the way through this, but if I were in charge of Scotland's defence posture after independence, I would be doing things very, very differently from this. The days of aircraft carriers and nuclear missile equipped submarines, I think, are largely gone. The deterrent doesn't work. The deterrent actually deterred the West from assisting Ukraine for fear of a nuclear strike from Russia, which has never ever materialized, despite the West crossing all of Putin's red lines. So nuclear deterrence doesn't work. We know it doesn't work because we've seen it doesn't work. So we need to dump it and replace our defensive array with something which does work, which does offer proper protection. And that's not going to happen under a British government locating all its most dangerous weapons in Scotland. Anyway, that's it from me today. Sorry, it's a bit of a jumbled subject, but I thought it was interesting to hear the views of this ex-naval commander, and the fact that nuclear submarines are not able to go to sea. I mean, that's just incredible, the fact that that's happening at all. That's it from Inde-Car today. Please like, subscribe, comment, and hit the notifications bell so you'll know when I'm going live in the future. It really motivates me to make more content like this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.